Welcome to our panel discussion on equity, diversity, and inclusion in freight transportation. I'm Dr. Judy Fravoldin, Executive Director of Mobility Network at the University of Toronto, and I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So again, welcome. This panel discussion on equity, diversity, and inclusion in freight transportation is part of our Smart Freight Center Freight Leaders series. This talk has three co-sponsors: the Smart Freight Center, Mobility Network, and the IST chapter. The student chapter of the Institute of Transportation Engineers connects its student members with the broader professional community and informs students about topics of interest in transportation engineering. The ITE student chapter welcomes sponsorship from neighboring and local industry and government partners. The Smart Freight Center is a collaborative research network among 4 regional universities: McMaster, Ryerson, York, and the University of Toronto. It was established with seed money from the region of Peel to improve economic vibrancy, environmental sustainability, and quality of life for residents in our region by improving goods movement. And finally, our brand new mobility network at the School of Cities. Transportation touches virtually all aspects of our lives. Mobility Network focuses the expertise of 60 researchers from across U of T's 3 campuses, whose diverse interests span the broad scope of critical issues about mobility. And we say in this, the first urban century, we must enable all people to achieve their potential while protecting our planet. And our way of doing it is through the equitable and sustainable and dignified movement of people and goods. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Alia Galal, our moderator. I'll pass it over to you, Alia, and you can go on to introduce our speakers. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. I'm so excited to be part of this panel discussion. So hello again, everyone. I'm Alia Galal, a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, doing research in the field of freight transportation and truck safety. And I'm happy to be the moderator of today's panel discussion. So we have 3 speakers who are all passionate about equity, diversity, and inclusion. So before we start, just a quick note about the event format. So we'll first have some time for each of the panelists to talk about her organization, what equity, diversity, and inclusion means to them, what initiatives their organizations have taken, and why EDI is actually important for the success of any organization. And then after their talks, we'll have, during the second half of the event, we'll open the panel discussion for about 15 minutes, followed by some questions and answers, where we'll take any questions from the audience. So before we start, I would just like to encourage everyone to type their questions as we go in the chat box, and we'll make sure to hopefully answer all of them by the end of the discussion. So let's get started. Our first speaker is from the region of Peel, Melissa Magder. Melissa is the advisor of strategic initiatives within the Office of Culture and Inclusion at the Regional Municipality of Peel. For the past 12 years, Melissa has been working in the field of diversity, inclusion, and equity, driven by her strong desire to create an inclusive environment where differences are valued and embraced. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Alia, and thanks to everyone for joining this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with my other panelists and colleagues. So a little bit about EDI at the region of Peel. I think that the region of Peel is, I was going to use the word unique, but I think one thing that makes our work exciting and different at the region of Peel is that we are so large. So as an organization, the region of Peel has the better part of 7,000 employees. And the nature of our business is very different. So we have several different lines of business, if you will. So we're in the business of public works, which is roads, construction, wastewater. With respect to transportation, we have our trans help vehicles, which fall under public works. We have human services, which is all of our social service functions. So settlement workers, Ontario Works, employment assistance, early years and childcare. So again, a number of programs and services that are under that department. And then we have public health. So imagine, in particular, the last couple of years with the pandemic. So all of Peel Public Health is part of the region of Peel. And then, of course, we have our internal services that support those three client-facing areas. So there's a number of businesses that we perform and a number of functions that we perform, which I think we'll probably talk to challenges a little bit later on. And that's certainly one of the challenges we have with this work, given that our employee base and our business is so diverse in and of itself. One thing I wanted to start with is, EDI, DEI, DNI, whatever acronyms you may be familiar with. It seems to be much more normalized right now where we sit in 2022, but this work has been happening for a number of years. I've been doing this work for 12 years, and to see it evolve and grow into what it is now is very different than what it was 12 years ago. 12 years ago, we were having conversations about different cultures and people from different countries, and maybe a little bit of gender, but at that point in time, the focus was women, not racialized women, just women. And so over time, the field and any practitioners in this field, it's evolved significantly. And so it's quite exciting for practitioners that have been here a while, because although what we're talking about now is not new, it's got the world's attention. And so it's been very exciting from that standpoint. I think there's a saying that, out of tragedy, is born innovation, and there's always some positivity that comes out of it. And at the region of Peel, I can say that it truly was the events of 2020 that just catapulted EDI into the spotlight. And so the two critical events being COVID and the pandemic, and just the inequities that were being revealed throughout health inequities, access, socioeconomic barriers. And then, of course, to probably no surprise to anyone here, was the death of George Floyd, or the murder of George Floyd. And those two events just put the world in a tailspin, but really shone a light on this work. And although, I was doing this work, my team was doing this work well before 2020, how do I say? I felt like we were the neglected child that was always trying to beg for attention, right? So just saying, hey, this work is really important, look at us, but there were always other priorities. There were always other business priorities and things that took precedence. And all of a sudden, things were reversed. And all of a sudden, we had our senior leaders saying, okay, like, what are we doing in this space, and what do we need to be doing? And it was a very interesting journey for us, because our executive leadership team is comprised of, well, at the time it was 7 individuals. We've made some structural changes, so it's down to 5. But we have a commissioner for every department, and then we have our chief administrative officer, our CAO. And there was this period of months where they were bought in, so we had commitment, but at the same time, they needed to be, I'm going to say, convinced of what the problem was. So we had their attention that there is a problem, and this needs this needs some attention and efforts committed. But they were really asking us, well, what is our problem, right? Within our organization, within our walls. And that really brought about the realization of the need for data. And I can't tell you how pivotal data has been in our journey and the doors it has opened up. So what we did, so what do I mean by data? Again, I go back to, we didn't have to convince them we had a problem, but they needed to better understand what the problem was. What were we trying to solve for? And so we undertook throughout 2020 and 2021, we undertook two big initiatives. One was our first workforce census. We'd never done anything like this in our organization. And for those of you that might not be familiar with what a workforce census is, it's very much like the census surveys we fill out every 4 or 5 years for Statistics Canada. But this was for our workforce. And it was quite shocking for us to sit in 2020 and come to the realization that we had no idea who worked for us. 7,000 employees, and we didn't know who they were. We knew their names, and we could run reports on date of birth, right? Because those were really the two pieces of data that were collected when you joined the organization. We didn't know gender, we didn't know ability, disability, we did not know gender identity, religion, faith, race, so on and so forth. And so we undertook this massive initiative to do our first workforce census. We had 50% of the organization respond, and that was amidst the first wave of the pandemic. So we actually took that as a win, given that the majority of our staff were redeployed. And statistically, it was deemed certainly significant enough to be representative of an organization our size. So we did have 3,000 employees fill out the survey. So for the first time, we had data. We had demographic data, but we also asked questions about employee experiences with EDI, specifically racism and discrimination. And there was a startling finding that on average across the organization, about 30% of our employees had experienced racism and or discrimination in the past 3 years working in our organization. Not something to be proud of, but a finding nonetheless that we can now sink our teeth into and do a deeper dive into what's the problem and what needs to change, right? So the workforce census was huge in that it gave us the most data we've ever had on our employee base. The second piece of data we gathered was by way of a series that we called Courageous Conversations. And again, this was coming off of the death of George Floyd. And we wanted to create a space, in particular for our Black employees, for grieving, venting, just talking. We wanted to provide a safe space because we've been receiving emails from different employees, and we could just tell that something had to be done. So we ran 7 sessions. We made the decision just to open it up to our Black employees, which our leaders were a little bit scared of, and how is that going to be perceived? But there's a saying that some of you may be familiar with, when a house is on fire, the fire trucks don't spray water on all the houses, they focus on the house that's on fire. And for our Black employees at the time, that was the house that was on fire. And so we had our seven executive leaders sit in a virtual space with our Black employees, and they just listened. And our employees spoke about experiences living in Black skin with racism and discrimination, not just out in the world, but at our organization. And there were tears, there were cracked voices, there were people openly scared that they were jeopardizing their employment by being so transparent. And the reaction from those 7 leaders of the organization, to say they were floored, it is an understatement. It's like they were hearing things that they truly never knew were happening or existed, and they were speechless. And so after we completed those sessions with our Black staff, and like I said, they weren't facilitated, they weren't structured. It was very much just a sharing platform. But it was so, I guess, successful, for lack of a better word. what we decided to do was run a series of courageous conversations for the next 10 months. And these conversations were open to all staff across the organization. Twice a month, we covered different dimensions of diversity, so the conversation was always focused. So we had a focused, courageous conversation on sexual orientation and other dimensions, so the whole 2S LGBTQ plus dimension of diversity. We ran one on ageism, women, ability and disability. We did Southeast Asian, we did East Asian, South Asian. We did one on religion and faith, and a few more I'm sure I'm not capturing, but we did span the gamut, if you will, of dimensions of diversity. In each of those sessions, we put out a call for employee volunteers to do a spotlight. We, again, to our surprise, had employees raise their hand and say, I want to share my story and my experience. So Indigenous, that's an important one that I forgot. And so we started each of the sessions with the employee spotlights. And then we asked questions across all of the series. We did it by way of polling, and it was our way of turning this into a data gathering exercise, right? So we asked questions on, have you experienced racism and discrimination at the region of Peel in the last 3 years? Was a yes or no? Does your people leader create a safe environment, for you and your team? Yes or no? What training needs? Do you think there's diverse representation in the organization at all levels, right? And so we were getting all of this data in the form of these conversations. And so what we did, we were able to do a report that themed the various challenges and experiences that were coming out of that. We took the two together. We took the results of our workforce census, and we took the Courageous Conversations report. And those two pieces of data brought us to a set of DEI recommendations. And those DEI recommendations span 5 focus areas. And that's where we're at now, is those recommendations were wholeheartedly endorsed and improved, and we are now implementing all of those recommendations. Now, I know I'm a little bit over time, so I'm just going to ask Alia, do you want me to pull up the slide, or do you want to hold on that for now?
Maybe it's better to share it during our panel discussion later, because just to give the others some time.
Okay, we'll keep everyone in suspense, and I'll share those areas in a little bit. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Melissa. There's a lot of interesting initiatives that the Peel region has taken. Moving on to the private sector and the relatively smaller scale, our second panelist is Rebecca Wellum from Geotab, the global leader in telematics solutions. Rebecca presently oversees global diversity, inclusion and belonging, compliance, enterprise risk and audit, and government account operations for Geotab. She also has a passion for diversity and compliance and has long advocated for disability awareness and equity. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Alia. Wonderful introduction from Melissa too, on to sort of just the evolution of this, right? From the private sector, so Geotab is not a freight carrier. We don't run trucks. We don't do logistics. We really are focused on engineering and tech that participates in that industry. So we make devices that plug into your vehicle, into the OBD port, and pull all kinds of driver behavior and engine data that help us to drive data insights that freight managers can use, fleet managers can use to improve the sustainability of their fleets, like moving from carbon emissions vehicles to EV, as well as to manage and monitor and mitigate driver behavior, get reporting that they need for regulatory requirements around electronic logging, so on and so forth. So my view of the world is a little bit sort of focused on a different aspect of everything, right? And being from a compliance background, I've looked at ESG, so environmental social governance, and this is sort of where diversity, inclusion, and belonging in my world has started coming to fruition. Like Melissa talked about, for us, the pivotal point here was the George Floyd murder, which I don't think would be surprising to just about anybody, because that was really the tipping point for all industries. And what was really important in the private sector was that was the tipping point for the financial sector, the investment sector, right? So the investment sector has pushed hard to require that companies who have been reporting on their corporate social responsibility, their diversity, their sustainability, focus them on actually providing audited results. So what the investment sector has said, we're not going to give any money. We're not going to help anybody go public if you can't tell us for sure that you're doing all these things. And it's more than just, I'm going to use the phrase lipstick on a pig, that you sort of gloss it over with the pretty marketing speak and pretty pictures and throw it up and say, hey, we're good guys. So what that means is, I mean, just to categorize and characterize Geotab a little bit, we've always had a culture of integrity. We've always had a very diverse workforce. And in fact, I would call our workforce predominantly diverse, right? So if you take all ranks of the company, we amount to about 35% white, which is not so bad, right? You think about all of the other cultures that kind of make up our genetic composition, and it's impressive compared to a lot of other companies. The problem with ours is that in the leadership of a private company that is a family-owned company, it really becomes, you don't have a lot of diversity at the top echelon. So my program, coming out of the George Floyd murder and into the we've got to do something, really became a matter of what is it? And so the data piece that Melissa mentioned is critical. Well, we haven't done censusing per se. In fact, I got my knuckles wrapped a wee bit because we did try to do that, but we've had to do it different ways. And so we've pulled it all into a voluntary status. When people are onboarded, they're asked about these different characteristics of themselves. It's still, I wouldn't say 100% complete, but we have begun to collect the data. And that's what I would say 2020 and 21 was us getting that understanding of really what do we do? How do we see it fluctuate month over month, year over year? And really, where do we go? We also signed up for Canada's 50-30 challenge. So the 50-30 challenge, if you're not familiar with it, is Canada's not a mandate, Canada's challenge to companies that will demonstrate 50% gender parity of leadership, senior leadership, and then 30% parity of all other represented classes in your senior leadership. And again, we went back to the data. We said, okay, what do we look like? Where can we go? And we're setting targets now by 2030 to meet those goals. Again, that helps us to understand sort of where the pockets of concern are. And it's helped us to ensure that the programs that we stand up under, these employee resource groups and the diversity program, reflect the crucial priorities of diversity within the numbers, right? So we can understand that our big pockets of exposure aren't necessarily on gender, but they are on the inclusion of Indigenous folks and the inclusion of Black folks within the upper ranks of our company. And so with that, I think what we've determined is the biggest push for us is to find out how these folks are finding barriers to come into a STEM organization, to STEM careers, to STEM education. Where do we have to play in order to make a difference that is sustainable, scalable, long-term? Because when you start talking about company pipelines, you can't look short-sightedly. You have to look at, sure, I could go out today and I could hire a pile of different people from all over the world that meet my criteria. But if they don't feel like they belong and they don't stay, and I don't have people who are willing to come in and replace them when they choose to leave, then I've gotten myself into another quandary and I'm going to have to redo everything over again. So where we're at right now is we're really focused on these pipelines, understanding what we can do through external partnerships to push more folks who meet those priority underrepresented groups for us into STEM education, STEM careers, STEM passion. And that will help us to help fuel the freight and logistics industry to go further into their environmental sustainable goals with diversity a part of it. I don't know if I overwent my time, but I saw that Melissa had a raised hand there. I'm happy to answer any kind of questions or.
Rebecca, that was awesome. I was trying to clap.
Oh, it's not been easy, right? So the fact of the matter is, data like this isn't really easy to come by. We have mandates that prevent, because they're protected classes, mandates that prevent us from sharing that information or demanding or mandating that. That's, I think, the best way to say it. It's a mandate. You can't do that. But you can ask for it voluntarily, but then you're also making decisions too with the best information available on a very small subsection of respondents, right? Like you've got to hope and pray that that's reflective of what you see everywhere else. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca, for the very informative talk. Now over to Sophia. Sophia is our final panelist, who is the Corporate Communications Officer for the Musket Transport Ltd and Commercial Heavy Equipment Training Ltd. Sophia has spearheaded initiatives such as Musket and CHET's gender-balanced recruitment strategy. She has also been a big proponent for drawing attention to the transportation industry, bringing forward proposals and innovative strategies for new standards and methodologies. Sophia, here you go.
Thank you very much. So just a little bit of background on the two companies that I represent. So we have Musket Transport, which is a private carrier, and Commercial Heavy Equipment Training, which we will refer to as CHET, the acronym, is our private career college. So we both employ drivers and train drivers as well. And that really puts us in a unique situation because we've had this relationship for well over 20 years. And it's given us a lot of insight to two different types of recruitment strategies, whether it comes from how do we encourage people to actually enter into truck driving as a career option. And the second portion is how do we recruit the existing driver pool into our carrier. And one thing that we realized once we created a marketing department, we really had to focus on our recruitment and retention strategies. And similar to what has been discussed today, data is always very, very crucial, but also very difficult to come by and actually store in a way where it's confidential and it is provided. So for lack of data source points internally, where we do have kind of loose ways to track it. For example, we know that we have over 74 languages spoken by our employees, which gives us a good understanding that we do have a diverse workforce, and the fact that most drivers usually come from the immigrant group. So even our company was set up by immigrants. And depending on the wave of immigrants at the time in Canada, usually influences the largest current demographic that makes up our driver pool. So we do have over 300 drivers, and we have owner operators as well. And I would say that's by far our largest diverse employee group. When it comes into our support staff, which includes mechanics, office staff, dispatcher, operations, the executive, etc., that's just over 100 individuals. So most of the time, most of our recruitment strategies and retention strategies are really focused on the driver side. They do make up the bulk of our company. And from that perspective, we're able to identify certain demographics that have always been, I wouldn't say intentionally not included, but missed out upon just because of their gender. So for example, we have a very specific target group for encouraging more women into the workforce and specifically behind the driver's wheels. So if you look through Trucking HR Canada statistics, women make up about 3% of the employees in the transportation sector. Right now, we're actually in a position where As a carrier of our size, we have 6 female drivers, which makes up 2.3% of our driver force, which sounds incredibly low and sadly is quite high for the industry. And that just speaks to the fact that we need to do so much more to encourage more women to consider this career. And a lot of the work that we do within my department caters to that fact. So creating content that is genuine and transparent. We're always working with our existing female drivers on what kind of content we can actually share so that we can entice women in. We created a female scholarship. So Musket actually funds on an annual basis a new female recruit to get their training for free through our school and then has the employment opportunity at Musket. We actually just concluded our second run yesterday. So we'll be moving on to naming our winner later this month, which is incredibly exciting. And that's one thing that we realized about removing barriers with specific target groups. So for example, with women and youth, which is our second biggest demographic that we have struggled to bring into the industry, there are funding options available through the government for skilled trade programs, but the federal government does not acknowledge truck driving as a skilled trade. Therefore, we're precluded from those funding options. So we really need to kind of go above and beyond a typical organization and work with our private career college and all of the other organizations that we've affiliated ourselves with over the last 20 years to close that gap. So the scholarship was really kind of the next step to help remove that original barrier so we can encourage more women to join. And really beyond that, we have to focus on rebranding as well. So something that we're really excited about from a marketing standpoint, we're working on a Mother's Day campaign where we will be showcasing the many different mothers that work at Musket. And that includes our drivers, dispatchers, executives, etc. It is also obviously on a volunteer basis. Not everyone is very comfortable in front of the camera. But we have found that it's incredibly successful to actually have a multi-channel approach to showcasing the diverse workforce you currently have. So you really do have to become very creative in how you're able to portray that and also inspire those employees to participate in this type of a campaign. So the same goes with interacting with the youth that we currently employ, and then our future demographics that we're currently working on. So for example, for us, getting in touch with the Indigenous community has always been a priority for us. It's always been very difficult because we don't have an existing group within the organization or an employee who could really give us that personal invitation. So that's something that we've always struggled with, but we continue to work towards. And the same goes with the veterans community. We're actually very lucky to have 2 veterans that are employed at the company. So they are now actively involved with building out our outreach campaign for the veterans community and educating ourselves on how can we actually be a militarily friendly and informed carrier and employer. Because a lot of these different demographics that we've been discussing, including the LGBTQ community and any others that we have really considered to approach, is that each one needs to be catered to. And it is very vital to have an individual approach because they have different needs, different challenges, and they have different barriers of entry. And we have to work at it as an organization to assess and familiarize ourselves with these different groups in order to be successful. Otherwise, it's not going to come off as genuine and you're not going to be able to build the relationships. So that's really where you have to have some level of transparency. But when you're working on marketing campaigns, which is really under my purview, you really need to avoid the use of stock images and stock videos and really lean into the diversity you currently have and try to glean as much information from those community members as you possibly can. So for us, the next steps would really be to capitalize on the data we currently have, but think about strategies on how we can motivate our different employee groups to participate and disclose more information so that they understand that we just want to improve ourselves as an organization. So I think that's really the key here. And I've learned, I was even taking notes while the other two speakers were presenting today, because I've gotten some good tips on ways that we can move forward as an organization. We're certainly smaller than the region of Peel, but what I do know is that we can learn a lot from one another. And I think that's something that it doesn't always happen in our industry. We're lucky within this panel, for example, we have a relationship with the region of Peel. We're part of the Peel Goods Movement Task Force. We're part of the Smart Freight Center. And all 4 of our terminals are out of the city of Mississauga. So we are very much entrenched within the region of Peel. And Geotab is actually our vendor. So we use their electronic logging devices and use a lot of the data they provide, especially when it comes to our environmental strategies and driver safety. So it's really amazing that we're able to get together and discuss the different challenges we have. But what I think is the most important and the most important message for students is to really investigate the industry that you want to be a part of and look into what opportunities your school provides. So whether it's taking advantage of co-ops, internship programs, scholarships that are being offered by carriers, for example, there's a lot of opportunities where you can actually get some time before you graduate in the area that you're in and really make a decision for yourself if that's something that you want to pursue following graduation. And the best way to understand if a company is actually genuine and if they are pursuing their EDI practices is to spend some time within the organization. And without that experience, you won't necessarily really be able to tell how genuine the marketing campaign is, so to speak. But really what I think is the most important is we continue to react in real time. So for example, right now, within our carrier group, with our establishment date, the bulk of our senior drivers are a part of the Slavic community. So right now we've been working together with our executive team on how we can best respond to the war in Ukraine to ensure that our employees who have been with us the longest feel supported and feel heard. So one thing we were able to get executive sign off on relatively quickly was to provide funding for the war in Ukraine to support the refugees. And we'll be creating a grant for 25 Ukrainian refugees that will come to Canada. And we'll provide free driver training for them so that they will have training opportunities and then employment opportunities once they have to build a new life. So I think that's really important to not just think about the long-term target demographic groups that you have in mind, but to also respond in real time to the needs of your immediate community, and then to also consider what are the important subjects or concerns of your existing employees so that they feel that they are being heard and supported. And for me right now, I'll just quickly put up my little slide in case anyone wants to take a screenshot. It's just some information for contacting us if I'm able to do it.
Great, we can actually start the panel with that. So thank you so much, Sophia, and thank you all for the very interesting talks. So what I liked most was that we have representatives from government organizations as well as private sectors, so we could clearly see the difference in scale. However, like some of the approaches were kind of similar, but different at the same time. So it was really interesting and exciting to learn about all the initiatives and the need for data, whether it's from a government organization or from private sector organization. So that's been really informative. Yeah, and so thinking about the future of equity, diversity, and inclusion, is it now too early to know how your organizations have changed as a result of the initiatives that were taken, or are there present effects that are clear to you? Maybe we can start with Melissa. Are the courageous conversations effective? Were they effective? Were there any felt changes?
Absolutely. And I can say that because we continue to get requests from employees asking us, can we have more courageous conversations? And everybody learned so much. And it's been interesting because our response is yes, you can always have a courageous conversation in your own teams, in your own departments, right? So there's this reliance on our team now. So there's been a huge change in the demand, appetite, and even expectations of employees to deliver on this front. But our message has been, this starts with conversation, in your own teams. This starts with supervisors and managers creating a psychologically safe and physically safe environment to have these conversations, encouraging people to, reflect on their own behavior. So it's definitely had an impact in terms of people feeling far more comfortable expressing their desire and appetite and pleasure with what our team has done. What we're trying to do now is make people less reliant on us and help them do the hard work. So how do we build knowledge and capacity and skills of our staff, particularly our managers and supervisors? Because not everybody, unfortunately, the reality is not everybody works in a safe environment where they feel comfortable bringing incidents and these topics of conversation to their team. So it's shifted back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm just curious to know whether the region of Peel had a plan in place before getting the results. Were there expectations about what these courageous conversations would lead to?
Is this for Matt's question about the census data? Okay.
Yeah.
So for the census data, it's a great question, Matt. We put a lot of focus on communication tools and aids, and being very transparent with staff about how the information they disclosed would be used, who would have access to it, who would not. And so for our first time out with this, the survey was anonymous. That presents pros and cons. We made that decision because, to be quite frank, the level of trust in leadership in the organization was not high. And so by going anonymous, we were very clear that we would not have access to the data. Only aggregate results were reported. So there was an anonymity threshold. So we could only report on dimensions of diversity where we had more than 6 scores. So everything was intentionally built so that people would not be able to guess and figure out who the person is that responded in such a way. The downside is that with going anonymous, there's no way to truly validate, who said what. So I heard that there were certain members that didn't feel safe in their department. So on their survey, they said they worked for a different department, or somebody might have said they were a supervisor when they weren't. So there's that kind of data that I wouldn't say is the most reliable. What will be different this year, so we're doing our second census this year, it's 2 years later, and this year we're going confidential. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how that impacts the participation rate. And I think it will also be a measure, to Alia's first question, of all the work and the efforts that we've been doing these last 2 years, will staff feel more comfortable voicing their opinion, knowing that we will know who said what? So it's going to be very, very interesting. But the short answer to Matt's question is absolutely. We give that a lot of attention beforehand.
Okay, that's great to know. And how about Rebecca? Do you, in Geotab, do you feel any difference as a result of implementing the EDI measures or initiatives?
Absolutely. So, and we're able to see through our recruitment stats that it is making a difference. It's marginal. It's progressive. To me, that's not scary. I'm glad I'm actually preferential to that kind of a steady kind of a shift in dynamic, because it means it's sustainable, right? It means it's not going to go away tomorrow. And right now, I'll tell you that most companies are very concerned around this Great Resignation and around all of the other pieces of the pandemic effect that it is having on our workforce. So Geotab has maintained, a good balance of remote versus in.
Okay, it seems like
Rebecca's frozen, right?
Yeah.
It's not just me.
Yeah, I thought it was me too. So yeah, we can just carry on with Sophia. Have you seen any improvements or any effects as a result of the EDI initiatives at CHET or Musket?
So I would say, especially with our target group for encouraging more females into the industry, we've definitely seen a lot of improvements. After we started to feel we were more successfully encouraging women into the driver role, we then took a look at our demographic breakdown from a gender perspective throughout the rest of the organization. So actually, I saw someone in the chat referenced our UN Women case study. So that was one of the times where we actually were able to gather that data. And now we have a formal case study, which represents supervisors and all the different internal promotions that we had. And it was actually very encouraging to go through that project because it proved that we do have quite a lot more females within the organization than originally assumed. So I would say it's a much higher number in other divisions than it is within our driver group, but that's also because it's our largest employee group. So then we kind of realized that even though we've done a lot of improvements internally to promote and support women within other divisions, we've now returned our focus to actually finding a way to bring more women into driver roles, because we're also interested in bringing more women into instructor roles. So there's several other projects where we're trying to figure out. The operations manager of CHET and myself, we've always dreamed of hiring a female instructor, and this has been a dream for over 5 years. And we're getting close that we might actually be able to. But aside from the fact that you have such a small female driver pool to pick from, it also has to be a person who's interested in teaching. But that's one thing that we think would make a really big difference for attracting more women, because a lot of the time they might feel safer sharing a cab with a female instructor than a male instructor. Not to say that any of our male instructors have had that experience or the management hasn't heard complaints, but I do think that it would at least remove another barrier. That someone might assume that it's unsafe just because of that one-on-one time they may have with a male instructor. And the fact that we also do deal with a lot of different immigrant groups and cultural dynamics where they would just not feel comfortable in that kind of a situation. So I think the more you learn about a particular demographic, the more challenges you uncover, which isn't a bad thing. It just means that you're now better able to respond to them on an individual basis and continue to move forward as an organization.
Mm-hmm. And you've also mentioned that about the women's scholarship. are there any other initiatives you're taking just to target the people you want to join your organization as like youth or women, other than
so with youth, thanks to the work of Trucking HR Canada, there's actually a lot of wage subsidies and training subsidies that are available for the youth demographic. So we're lucky to be associated with that organization, and we can close that funding gap for that particular demographic group. But the one where I would be optimistic to say that next year we could potentially introduce another scholarship. And that's one that I'm interested for the Indigenous community. But as I mentioned, it's really important for us to develop those relationships with our local organizations and to have that forum where we can actually advertise the scholarship. Just because we put it together, throw it up online, doesn't mean we'll actually receive applicants because we're not plugged into that community group as of yet. This is something that we're currently working on developing. And once we establish those relationships, then we're able to set up a scholarship that we can then advertise through their channels, because they use very different channels when it comes to training and employment opportunities. And unless we have that relationship, it's not going to be a fruitful effort. So that's the type of campaign I would call lipstick on a pig, as Rebecca referred to earlier, because sure, it looks great on the outside that we're doing something to encourage this demographic group, but in the end it will be like, oh, well, no one applied. So it doesn't really end up being a genuine effort. And the same goes to when we really want to include the LGBTQ community, because that's something that we've always grappled with. We've only come across employees who identify as that group by accident, in terms of like they volunteered that information, because of course you can't really ask how they identify. But once they have, I've been lucky enough to be one of the people that learned about it. So I was able to glean more information of what can we do without also specifically being like, hey, are you LGBTQ? That's not the way we want to go about it. And what was shared with me is that it's much more important to have transparency within the organization and to have that formalized HR approach, that if an incident did occur, do they feel safe coming forward and sharing the incident with management? And that's something that really hit home with me, because that would apply to all EDI practices. You really have to have a system built within the organization where all individuals feel comfortable bringing forward an incident and feel that they would be heard and that it would be responded to by the organization.
Mm-hmm. I'm afraid we only have a couple of minutes left, so I would like to hear the same question answered by Rebecca and Melissa as well. So what do your organizations do to target the specific populations that you want to hire?
Oh, if you don't mind, Melissa, I'll go first. Sure. I'm sorry. It would always happen in the middle of something important like this. The internet drops, but my apologies for that earlier. What I was trying to say then was everything is being done now with a diversity lens, and we've made errors along the way. So I guess if you're focusing, just to circle back a little bit, because I think it pertains to this as well. If you're looking for a place to work that is diverse, that is focused here and is putting authentic, genuine, sincere effort behind it, understand that there are going to be bumps, right? So don't expect perfection when you come in the door. That's part of what you're there to help for, right? So bringing you in is to help us to figure this out too, not just to do the doing. And for us, we've done a lot of work with external partnerships. So we've invested the time and the money and gone out to organizations like Black Professionals in Tech Network. We're working hard to diversify our networks. We're pushing and trying to get visibility with those people that we want to attract. Similarly, we're working with an organization called Actua out of Ottawa that is helping us to tap into some of the things that we need to do for the Indigenous community. So we are strategically pushing our funding into areas that we think will help us to build that long-term pipeline and to help make sure that folks who are already in staff see that effort being put forward and to the right places. I think we're doing quite a lot in terms of, employee engagement. The training is important. We've done a bunch of terminology reviews, and people are trying to change their language just around, master services agreement is no longer a master service agreement. It is a main service agreement, or it's a primary something, so we've done a lot of that kind of work to help to sort of institutionalize that lens, right? Sorry. Mm-hmm. Long-winded answer there, sorry.
Melissa, last thought on this?
The question is more like, what are we doing for sort of targeted outreach to get these diverse groups interested or attracted? I would say, similar to Sophia and Rebecca, it's really a multi-pronged approach. So one of our recommendations is to develop a diversity recruitment strategy. And so part of that will be, again, building relationships and really looking at sort of who we source talent from, and where are those gaps. So going into these communities, these different groups, diverse groups that we're talking about. But the other half of that is what makes you an organization that people want to work for, right? So I can, the one part of it is access, right? So in terms of awareness and knowledge and access to opportunities, but the other part is what you do on the inside. So it's kind of a tandem approach. And I think it was, I don't know if it was Rebecca or Sophia that spoke to retention, right? So it's one thing to get people in the door, but it's going to be a real culture of inclusion and belonging and embracing of differences that makes people stay, as well as advancement, right? So another thing we're doing is we're currently building an inclusive succession planning framework with, again, as Rebecca said, an EDI lens, right? To ensure that our diverse employee base actually progress through the organization so that we see diversity at the upper echelon. So it's a multitude of things. It's mitigating bias out of the recruitment processes. So it's a lot of EDI lenses on policies, practices, processes, outreach, and then an equal amount of emphasis on what we're doing internally, so that we're truly walking the walk. And then word gets out, right? And then you hear people saying, yeah, the region of Peel is a great place to work for. And that's ultimately how it comes back to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I could expand on that conversation for more hours, but unfortunately our time's up. So thank you so much for all this information and steps and initiatives your organizations are taking and will take. Judy, would you like to take over?
Oops. Hi. Nothing to add. That was, I was smiling a lot of the time as I heard about the synergies of your work. It made me reflect on the things that happen around us, my own experiences, and hopeful about the way forward. Because the thing we learned today is that we have a regional government, and I know we have more than one great local government and great companies in our region taking really great leadership roles in this. And that and work together and with us. So this is all remarkably wonderful. I want to thank everybody who joined us. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for your questions. Thanks especially to our panelists. Aliyah, wonderful job. Hope to see you all back again at some other event of the Smart Freight Center and the Mobility Network. The IT student chapter hosts regular events. There's a lot going on at University of Toronto, and we're so pleased you joined us here. We hope to see you again. Thank you all so very, very much.